everyone, and welcome, whether you be here in the Wolfson with the speaker and panel, or whether you're on Zoom. I hope we can cater for both of you successfully. So welcome to this very special talk, designed in the run-up to COP26, to help us all think hard about what it takes to make a sustainable world and what each of us can do to contribute to this. So let me outline how things are going to work. We'll begin with a talk by college fellow Dame Polly Courtice entitled, well, you've got the title there, Sustainability, the Global and the Local. Polly is founder director of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, usually known as CISL, a post she retired from about 6 months ago. This has become an extremely influential institution, and those of you living in the city will know that she has set up a move to new headquarters, much more spacious than the current CISL home in the former telephone exchange on Regent Street. And this will be a world first for a retrofitted sustainable office building, setting new standards for low energy use, carbon emissions, and impact on natural resources, as well as user experience and well-being measured against multiple benchmarks. The conversion of this building, which she is spearheading, will create an ultra-low carbon sustainability hub and a new home for CISL as it scales up business, government and academic leadership, collaboration and innovation to accelerate the inclusive global transition. Polly herself has worked with many companies and served as a non-executive director and board member for a number of organisations ranging from AstraZeneca to Anglian Water. She's a member of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commission on Climate. So, as you can tell, she's eminently well qualified to lead tonight's discourse. After she's spoken, and she tells me she'll speak for about half an hour, we will then hear briefly from 4 other members of the Churchill community, looking at issues from their different perspectives within and beyond the college. And finally, there'll be time for questions, both from those physically present here and also those watching over Zoom. And for the latter, can I remind you that you can post questions at any time through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll pick them up on my laptop after all the speakers have finished. So it's going to be quite a packed agenda. For now, I'll introduce our 4 speakers on the panel after we've heard from Polly. So over to you.
Thank you for that welcome, Master. Good evening. It's great to be here this evening. Good evening to everybody online, but it's also wonderful to see people in 3D here in the room today. As the Master says, I've been asked to take a look at the big global system pressures and trends that are shaping our world. Of course, much of this will be very familiar to most of you. And in many ways, it's not a pretty story. But the point here is to look at the scale and the connectedness and the urgency of the issues, and then consider what we might be able to do about them, particularly from a leadership perspective. So the first thing to recognize is that we've only got one of these. And all the evidence is pointing to the fact that we're not behaving that way. It's a complex and interconnected object, and it consists of a set of interconnected systems upon which we rely. You can see climate, energy, livelihoods and health, water, food, the services that we derive from a functioning, healthy, natural system. At the outer circle are the ecosystems that underpin those services. Again, you can see wood, minerals, soil fertility, pollination, flood protection, carbon sequestration. And the worrying thing is that every time a new report comes out, the scientific evidence about the health of many of those ecosystems shows them in a bad way, sometimes terminal. The destruction of the oceans, 1 million species threatened with extinction, the poor state of the land. Just 2 weeks ago, the Natural History Museum report came out with new data to show that the world's overall biodiversity intactness is estimated at 75%. That's significantly lower than the 90% average considered to be a safe limit for humanity. On this scale, the UK's index reading was 53%, in the bottom 10% of the world, globally, one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. So this is how we traditionally look at the planet. There's the biosphere, there we are, there's the economy. We spend a huge amount of time on the economy, making it work, making it grow. And we're beginning to recognize that the way in which that economy functions and is managed has a profound impact, not just on society, but on the environment. The socket on the right there is Earth's resource. It's stubbornly one planet big. It's not going to get any bigger. We can clearly get more efficient in terms of how we use resource, but the plug of human demand is growing the whole time. And it's getting more and more difficult to push that plug in than when there were fewer people consuming less stuff. There's a day in the year, many of you will be familiar with it, it's called Earth Overshoot Day. The calculation is done about the amount of renewable stuff the planet can produce during the year, and then how quickly we consume that. Earth Overshoot Day comes when we consume more than one planet's worth of annually renewable resource. This year, it was July the 29th. So on July the 30th, we were effectively using planetary capital rather than living off the interest, and that's inherently unsustainable. That's the global average, by the way. Basically, if we lived, for example, as people live in Qatar, Earth Overshoot Day would be February the 9th. So from February the 10th, you're living on planetary capital. Every country on this slide is living at a pace beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And if you're looking for where the UK is, it's around about 4 p.m., somewhere in May there. April-May time is when many European countries overshoot. This is the big picture, though. It's called the Great Acceleration. On the left-hand side, you can see a set of steep red curves reflecting extraordinary growth, socioeconomic development, activity since 1950. In each case, you see a little vertical dotted line. That's 1950. And you can see what they are: population growth, GDP, growth of urban populations, fertilizer consumption, large dams, paper production, water use, etc. Extraordinary activity in the last 70 years. Lots of good things happening there. We're living longer, we're healthier by and large, girls are going to school, so much to be grateful for. On the right-hand side, the blue curves, pretty much as steep, same 1950s dotted line, the practical consequences of all that activity on the left. Greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, increased surface temperature, ocean acidification, tropical forest lost. It goes on and on, often uncosted and until recently not really considered to be a problem. So I just want to look at a couple of them. That little blue sphere there represents all the water on the planet brought together in one place. If you empty the oceans, melt the ice caps, every single drop of water on the planet. That's not very much water, not least because 97% of it is salt. The little blue and white wedges there on the left-hand side reflect the amount of fresh water that's available. 2.5% of that fresh water is frozen. And we kind of need to let it stay that way, because if we melt it all, sea level would rise by 70 meters. So the fresh water that's available to us is 0.5% of that sphere. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the vast majority of that is in aquifers. We could pump that up, but actually in lots of parts of the world, it can take decades or hundreds of years to percolate back down. So that's not a good option. So the issue is not have we got enough water, it's what kind of water and where it is and how we're going to use it. And there are profound implications for using it wrongly. And if water is scarce, so too is arable land. Less than 10% of the world's land area is suitable for growing crops. So what we do with arable land, how we treat it, is really critical. And we're not treating it very well. It's been estimated that globally we're losing about 30 billion tons of soil a year at the moment. mostly through rain and wind erosion and agricultural practices, and that will be exacerbated by extreme weather events associated with climate change. So by 2070, soil loss could reach roughly 71 billion tons a year. Here's a local example. This post was stuck into the ground and hammered completely into the ground in 1852 by an engineer just before we started draining the fens. As you can see, the soil has shrunk by 4 meters since 1852. In fact, in the last 150 years, we have lost 3/4 of East Anglia's topsoil. That's a lot of topsoil to have lost from across this region. This is the food-water-energy nexus. 23% of all fossil fuels globally are used to produce food. 2/3 of all fresh water globally is used to produce food, and huge amounts of water go into the energy sector as well. And with a population that's predicted to grow to 9 billion by 2040, we're going to need 50% more food, 30% more water, and 30% more energy. So in anticipating the need to feed a lot more people in the coming years in an affordable way, we have to be very careful about the relationship between food, energy, and water. The red line here is the rate of annual population growth, and as you can see, since about the mid-1960s, the pace at which global population is growing has slowed down really quite dramatically, and it's projected to slow down right through to the end of the century. But in terms of actual numbers of people on the planet, we're heading for nearly 11 billion by the end of the century. Here's where we are now, 7.8 billion. There's the 10.9 billion by the end of the century, and in less than 30 years, we're expected to reach around about 9.7 billion. So we're going to add about 2 billion people to the planet, and that's a big demand increase. And in terms of where this population growth will be, the blue circles are populations in 1950, so before the Great Acceleration. The red circles are the expected population by the end of the century. So the red circles are the 11 billion world. You can see where populations are not expected to grow in Europe, Russia, Japan, but dramatic growth is expected in South Asia, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, some bits of the Americas. And just to put things into perspective, the population of Nigeria will exceed that of the United States in about 12 to 15 years' time. And they're not going to be living in cities like this. This is a rather fanciful version of Paris in the 21st century, or in places like this. This is a real building, by the way. It's not a Photoshop. It's actually in Hong Kong. They're more likely to be living in places like this. Cities grow at about 200,000 people per day globally, and many are living in unplanned areas like this. This is the Mutare Valley in Nairobi. In many ways, these can be amazing places. They're very vibrant. The communities tend to be strong, but they're not great places for the next 2 billion people. Climate change, briefly. 1880 was a very hot year in West Africa. You can see these countries with the large red circles: Côte d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Senegal, Sierra Leone. That was a 2 degrees hotter than normal summer. Now have a look and see what happened since 1880. We've known about the greenhouse gas effect for 150 years, but it's really only in the last 20 or 30 years, if you weren't a scientist, that you would have started to spot a difference. And of course, the years 2018, 2019, and 2020 have been the hottest on record. This chart is from the latest report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows the linear relationship between CO2 emissions and global surface temperature increase from 1850 and up to 2050 across a range of scenarios. And by any scenario, the evidence for urgent action is utterly compelling. For the non-scientists, this is shorthand for the climate change we have set in train. Hotter hots, colder colds, drier dries, wetter wets. We've already seen the catastrophic consequences of this across the world. Just this week, the heavy rainfall in Kerala in India has caused deadly landslides and flooding, and much greater severity is predicted in future around the world. We lost almost 270 billion tons of ice a year for the first 20 years of this century. Greenland lost 1 million tons of ice a minute for the whole of 2019. So we're seeing dramatic ice loss. And why this matters is because if we were to warm the planet to 2 degrees, which is still looking pretty possible, in the darkest blue countries on this map, between 75 and 100% of the population are currently living on land that would be flooded at 2 degrees. Between 25% and 50% of the whole of Australasia, New Zealand, and much of Southeast Asia have people living on the land that we flooded at 2 degrees. These, of course, are very long-term processes, a combination of ice melt and thermal expansion. But if you think a few million people on the move in terms of looking for better life is a problem now, just wait until we start seeing some of these consequences. If we were able to bring emissions under control, we've still got large areas on the planet, as you can see there on the left-hand side, that could be suitable for crop production by the end of the century. But if we continue with business as usual, here on the right-hand side, you can see the areas potentially and likely outside the safe space for crop production. And if you think about where in the world the population growth is going to be, you can see a pretty disturbing overlap. India, Far East, Sub-Saharan Africa, places where we're not going to be able to produce food unless we dramatically change the way we operate our economies. And on top of that, with business as usual, by 2050, 1.8 billion people will be living in regions with absolute water scarcity. And by 2030, water scarcity will displace anywhere between 24 million and 74 million people. Of course, this is not only caused by climate change, also by pollution, poor governance, and underinvestment in water systems. But it's pretty drastic. That white dotted line there on the left shows global CO2 emissions remorselessly increasing year on year since 1980. A tiny dip last year as we shut everything down, but not for very long. But if you look at what we need to do to keep temperatures to a 1.5 degree average, a 1.5 degree average rise, we're going to have to reduce and remove carbon from our economy consistently year on year to hit net zero by the mid-century. And then we're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere for the rest of the century. We don't have the technologies available to do that yet, so that's yet another problem. Here on the right-hand side are the 3 main greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. In the middle column is where it comes from across the entire economy, in fact. Road, air, rail transport at the top, heating and cooling our buildings, iron and steel production, chemicals, cement, etc., etc. The bottom third, the green and the purple, are food and land. They account for 1/3 of our emissions. So we're going to have to decarbonize everything that's in those red and orange bands very fast, right down through the supply chain. And then we're going to have to work out how to get to grips with feeding a growing population in a way that does not do damage to the ecosystems upon which we depend. Here are the 4 largest emitters of CO2 equivalent on the planet. Not sure who you think the 4th one is. In fact, it's cows. Cows produce more than twice the CO2 equivalent of India. So this is not just about offsetting flights or buying an electric car. It's about really understanding where the greatest impact is, and it's about major behavioral change. There are also huge health benefits from decarbonisation. Air pollution kills 7 million people per year globally. Half of Delhi's school children suffers from some form of irreversible lung damage from poor air quality. On a more positive note, this graphic is from the report published on Monday by this region's Independent Commission on Climate Change, which I'm a great pleasure to be part of. It points out that if we tackle climate change effectively, we can also deliver enormous co-benefits and opportunities, including new jobs in the green economy, healthier homes and workplaces, lower energy bills, cleaner air, improved public transport, better health and well-being. But importantly, the report also stresses that fairness must be at the core of any delivery of such action. The transition must be just and not penalise those who did the least to cause the problem or who can least afford to take action. The International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook report was published last week. It recognises that a new energy economy is emerging around the world as solar, wind, electric vehicles and other low-carbon technologies flourish, but it points out that clean energy production progress is still far too slow to reach net zero by 2050, and fossil fuel production must slow down much more quickly than firms are currently planning for. Here's a report that came out in the same week. It details how 10 companies, just 10 companies, in the private equity industry have invested at least 1.1 trillion into the energy sector over the last decade, and 80% of that has gone into fossil fuels. So although a growing number of banks and investors are shying away from investing in fossil fuels, there's still a lot of money bottom fishing for bargain prices in oil wells, coal-fired plants, and other massively inefficient operations, pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So, are we going to be able to sort these things out through technology? There have been some remarkable advances in clean tech and green tech, and there are also huge opportunities around, including artificial intelligence and automation. This is a report from the World Economic Forum which suggests where some of these innovations could really be applied. You can see there tackling climate change, biodiversity, healthy oceans, coming up with really innovative solutions to help us tackle some of these challenges. But the sting in the tail is that around 50% of jobs are at high risk of being computerized or automated over the next 20 years. This is how we used to make cars in the 1950s, and this is how we make them now. And the jobs at the top could have been badly paid and unsafe. Sorry, this is how we make them now. The jobs at the top could be poorly paid, unsafe, boring. So it's not just about preserving jobs, it's about taking jobs out of the economy, out of society. We've shifted from rewarding labor to rewarding capital. And underpinning that, we're seeing an unprecedented level of income inequality. This chart shows the national income of the top 10% of earners globally going steadily upwards. And the poor in lots of parts of the world are getting a bit richer, but the rich are getting spectacularly richer. And the proportion of national wealth finding its way into the hands of a very few is growing around the world. I realize that I've been running a little too slow, so I'm going to speed up a little. The result of this is we've seen a lot more of this in the last few years, people pouring out onto the streets, protesting about something. Often it's a relatively minor thing that triggers their protests, but what they're actually saying is that this system isn't working for me, the system is unfair, you politicians don't care. This is the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risk Report. You can see some of the biggest risks. The top right-hand corner is highest risk, highest likelihood. And we biodiversity loss, and of course infectious diseases racing in from the right there. But these are the issues that are really starting to rise up the agenda, the social issues, livelihood crises, social cohesion erosion, youth disillusionment. These are the social issues coming up alongside the environmental issues, and they are going to be exacerbated by those environmental issues. And to solve those problems, you have to look at these things as an inextricably, totally connected world. Here's the linear economy. Recently, there's been a huge shift towards the circular economy where things are designed, built, and made available in such a way that nothing is thrown away, where there is no such thing as waste. And overarching all of this are the UN Sustainable Goals produced by governments with deep involvement from business and civil society. Lots of things where you'd like to see them improve, but actually it's the best plan we've got, adopted by 193 countries around the world and reflecting the systemic nature of what needs to happen. The business community is seeing the SDGs as a really useful framing. They're identifying a whole raft of opportunities from unlocking the SDGs, from cashing in on the clean energy transition, but they're also looking at many of the risks that are associated with this agenda, seeing the impact down their supply chains, on markets, on their reputations, and worrying about how climate change sentiments will impact their investments. As Mark Carney said, firms ignoring the climate crisis will go bankrupt. Lots of companies in the run-up to COP26 are joining the race to net zero, demanding more bold policy and urgent action. You can be skeptical about their motives, but we can't do it without them. And of course, there's a huge proliferation of initiatives from governments around the world, which is absolutely vital since on the whole, the voluntary sector has not worked. This week, the UK government published its long-awaited net zero strategy, pretty widely welcomed, but there are those who feel it's still lacking it's needed to close the gap between climate promises and climate action. And you can see here just how few countries around the world, this is the Climate Action Tracker, how few countries around the world have an almost sufficient set of policies to get us to net zero. And the production gap report that came out on Wednesday of this week shows that plans to extract fossil fuels are incompatible with net zero. So we have to see what's going to happen at the COP. Stark warning from the IPCC, code red for humanity, and this urgent message from the UN Secretary General. I count on government leaders and all stakeholders to ensure COP26 is a success. Added to that, there's real sense of rising public concern, increasingly anger around the world, which we hope will help to shift the dial, perhaps none more so than youth activism. But no one group of actors can do this alone. To make a difference, it's going to take a combination of all those actors working together with determination and urgency if we're going to respond in time. This message from Nick Stern: acting together brings political will, and political will brings action. I am optimistic that we can do it, but anxious as to whether we will do it. And that brings us back to the idea that we have to solve these challenges as a system. We can't pick them off in isolation. As Prof. Bob Scholes said last year, nature will survive in one way or another. The human species might, but economies and civilizations might not. So the real message is about urgency. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. There is such a thing as being too late. We must move past indecision to action. And from one legend to another, a concluding message: what each one of us does in the next few years will determine our future in the next few thousand years. It will define our legacy to all future generations. So our sustainability lies in our hands. That is the leadership challenge I think we are here to discuss. Thank you.
Tremendous overview, even if slightly inevitably depressing.
Overrun, I'm sorry.
No, I wasn't talking about that. So we will now move over to the panel discussion if the four of you would like to come up. Let me remind the Zoom audience that you can post questions. The real audience we will come to as well. We will do that in parallel. But first up, we're going to have a few words from, in order, Steve Davidson, who is Deputy Director of Cambridge Zero, with responsibility for strategy and planning. Steve's background is in strategic communication and partnerships. Before he went to Cambridge Zero, he was head of international partnerships in the university. And prior to coming to Cambridge, Steve worked in Westminster as head of environment for the think tank Policy Connect. Then we seem to have got people out of order. Then it's going to be George Crimes, according to my notes. George is the JCR Green Officer in the college. He's a second year MML student, and he'll talk about issues facing students and what they can do. And I know some of his work relates to the other green officers around the university as well, so there's quite a coherent network there. Then we'll hear from Alison Ming, who will be focusing on how scientists can communicate their data effectively to form part of the evidence base for policymakers. Alison researches atmospheric dynamics and climate more generally, and is the SCR lead on in the college on green impact projects. She led a project on single-use plastics pre-pandemic. And finally, Tom Boden will talk. He's the estates manager for the college and has been driving many projects with sustainability at their heart, helping to make Churchill, as I feel is very appropriate as a college with a STEM focus, a leader in this arena, and he'll talk a bit about that. So if I can turn first to Steve.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Polly. That was an incredible presentation, equal parts fascinating, terrifying, and inspiring. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about how universities play a leadership role, and the way I've interpreted that is how universities contribute to a broader common good beyond their core functions of research and education. And I'm going to touch on three elements where I think universities do that. And the first of those is leading by example, which in many ways is the most obvious, but actually the most important. Because, you know, shouting and talking is all very well, but actually real leadership is when you set a direction, you head in that direction, and you bring others people with you. And we can do that because at the University of Cambridge we have 800 years of history, we have a global reputation, we have autonomy, which is really important in this space, and of course we have trust. And in many ways this means that the actions aren't as important, although they are very important, but the actions we take are less important than the message that this actually inspires. And there are a number of ways that we're doing this at the moment. Of course, the creation of Cambridge Zero, this enormous sort of initiative that brings together so many bits of the university that I'm very proud to be part of, is one part of that. And it's quite an unusual sort of setup across institutions, and it's a real statement of intent. Then, of course, there are the targets and the ambitions that we're setting. So we were the first university to adopt a 1.5 degree science-based target. There's the commitment around divestment from fossil fuels by 2030. And then, of course, there are the things that we're doing on the ground in terms of our decarbonisation activity, what we're trying to achieve in terms of, you know, degasifying the estate, projects such as the Utopia building, which is a real cutting-edge retrofit project. These are all very important, and I think we can be proud of what we're achieving, but of course there's always more to be done in this space. The second element that I think is important in terms of institutional leadership is about the institutional voice. And in many ways this is a little bit tougher. Because universities are quite restricted in what they can say in terms of advocacy, partly by their own structures, but also by the expectations and rules externally. But that doesn't mean that we're completely without any sort of control in this space, because we can shape the narrative. And we can do that by the themes that we choose to focus on, through the speeches that are given, through the stories that we put out there, and the events that we hold. And the sort of themes I'm talking about, we're talking sort of high-level stuff, so how we move from ambition, which is so important in this space and means something very particular in a COP environment, to action, to making sure that things are happening on the ground. It's the importance of fairness, inclusion, transparency. You know, the voice of the Global South is key in this space. It's about creating a positive vision, which isn't necessarily the sort of vision that you showed there with all the green, you know, because sometimes if you're not careful, you're selling something which is unrealistic. What I'm talking here is about a vision that where we feel comfortable, where we feel responsible, and where we feel as though, you know, we have a good relationship with nature. And then there's the importance of consensus, which in this space, you know, there is huge scientific consensus, but division causes real problems. If people start to look as though they're saying slightly different things, then it's used against us. It makes it look as though we don't know what we're talking about, or at least, you know, it undermines trust. And that's been a real problem in the past. So the final element that I want to just mention before handing over to George is, which I think is a really important element, is how we demonstrate institutional leadership through mobilizing connections and communities. And as Polly mentioned, you know, there are a huge amount of players here. You know, there are a lot of actors in this space. The Paris Agreement had, I think, 196 signatories. That's 196 sovereign countries with their own government system. That doesn't take into account, of course, all the businesses and the civil society and all of those different groups that are having to work together. So power is fragmented, and that makes it quite hard to coordinate and bring things together. But universities are uniquely placed in this space because we're communities of communities. We cut across all sorts of different networks. And those aren't just academic, they're not just national, they're international. You know, there are policy networks, there are business networks, and we're there at the center of all of this, bringing these things together. The challenge, of course, is how we get the most out of these networks, and we have a certain convening power, which is very, very powerful in this space. But there's also this element of how we welcome, how we bridge clusters. You know, we try and get to those networks which ultimately have more sort of impact, but we might not have so much influence over. And so that bridging role is really, really important. We have to kind of avoid just talking to ourselves and avoiding the comfortable and reach out to different groups. And I'm going to leave it there, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's food for thought, definitely. And I hope people are thinking about the questions they want to pose. And please, again, particularly for the Zoom people, do specify who your question's directed to. George.
Apologies if my voice is a bit croaky. I've had a bit of freshers flu going around. Part of the student life, I guess. But just first thing to say, thanks to Polly. That was an extremely, extremely powerful talk with a lot to take in and a lot to kind of internalize. And I guess that's sort of the challenge as us green officers. There are a few of us around the university working in the individual colleges, but also working together to share ideas, is kind of communicating that powerful message, the severity of our situation, to the local level. And I guess that's a problem that everyone's talking about in a way, is how you square the global with the local, and how we kind of bring the severity of our times to our local everyday actions, and how we bring it as part of our mindset and how we lead our lives. And a thing to say is, for my generation, so I was born in 2001, it really is the defining characteristic of our lives. I'm going to grow up into a world where there is no choice but to make these changes. And as the one that really strikes me is the problem of climate refugees, and how people are going to be moving around the world in response to ecological breakdowns, and how that's going to bring turmoil to our political systems. And so for me, the real challenge is preparing the student body, preparing my fellow students and people of my age for what's coming, and making them aware of the severities of our time and how to respond to it. So I guess that's part of what I'm looking to do as a green officer, working with Tom and the college especially to create a mindset, I guess. I call it a culture of sustainability. I gave a talk the other week to the freshers, kind of inducting them into the college and a kind of vision for the future, a mode of living where everyone cares about what they're doing, their impact, and really it starts with the menial things like recycling or food waste. But for me, I think there's a lot contained in those everyday small actions. And in a college environment like this, where we have a sense of community, and I feel that if we can build a sense of community around working towards protecting our environment, then we have something really powerful. And I appreciate everything that the Master has said about turning this college into a place that leads in terms of sustainability and innovation. And also Tom has been doing extremely, extremely helpful work, bringing the students involved and leading the way forward, because it really is a challenge for our generation. And I believe that at Churchill we can make a big difference in terms of our community. That was just one of the aspects I wanted to talk about, the importance of it for our generation and as students leading the way in terms of innovation and the everyday lives that we lead. But kind of while I have the opportunity to speak to everyone here, there's an important thing that I want to talk about in terms of how we approach sustainability. And Steve touched upon it a bit in terms of positivity. We can't just talk all about the doom and gloom and the severity of our times. We also have to have something to believe in, and that's to do with leadership, I think. The best leaders inspire people to fight for something, to have something to protect, something to save. And a trend of our time at the moment is the demystification of the world. There aren't things to believe in, there aren't things to rally behind. But for me, and part of my role as a Green Officer, is to bring people back focused to the wonders of nature. There's the Arctic tern, which is a bird that migrates however many thousands of miles each year, and in its 30-year lifetime, it flies to the moon and back 3 times. Isn't that just incredible? Maybe it's not. But for me, that was a bit of a distraction. But if we can realign our focus to nature and its wonders and bring that into our discourse about sustainability and what we're saving, what we're actually fighting for. Just at the beginning of Polly's talk, the picture of the Earth from space. If we can instill in people's minds when they're growing up into the world that this is an amazing, incredible place and there's only one of it, I think that's a really powerful thing that we need to bring into our discourses. So if people have any questions about that, please do ask. And I guess an example of a thing that we've had the opportunity to do here at Churchill College with our amazing grounds. I ran a nature talk the other week, giving people a walk around the college, showing some of the incredible species of plants, as well as the statues, which are pretty cool as well. And just, inspiring people around a collective faith in nature. Cool, that's what I had to say, really. And I'll pass on to Alison, I believe.
It's Alison next.
Okay, so the Master asked me to talk a bit about the role of scientists in communicating climate change, and I'm going to be brief because I want to leave some time for questions. But I think so. From when I started my PhD to now, I've increasingly realised that I do need to get more involved in climate communication because of the field I'm in, and I see it as part of my responsibility to basically make sure that what we are generating as science outputs. You've seen in Polly's talk, there was lots of facts, lots of figures, there were some plots. There's a lot of science and a lot of research that goes behind all of these. And all of this gets distilled into understandable messages that the general public can take and know what's going on in terms of climate change in the world. And I see the role of scientists as being the people who actually have a lot of knowledge, possibly about a series of their own little research area. But as scientists and as climate scientists, they have a good understanding of the broader perspectives. We can read the reports, such as the IPCC reports, and we can actually pick out the big messages from this. And it is, I think, part of our social responsibility to go and read those reports, pick out the big messages, and communicate them to the general public so that they know what's going on in the science. And I also think that we should be talking more to policymakers to make sure that we use our expertise in a good way to sort of bridge the gap between what's going on in scientific research papers and helping towards the sort of helping policy decisions. And one of the things that we've done in collaboration with Cambridge Zero is following the latest IPCC report, which is 1,400 pages. The layperson is not going to open this report and take a look at it. But we've looked at various documents, we've opened various bits of this report, and we've picked out key messages and produced a 6-page summary. And I think that's a really good way, one way in which we can get across the messages. The other thing that I wanted to mention is So I'm on science Twitter, which is basically me following other scientists, other climate scientists, and we generally geek out about climate-related facts. But increasingly, the conversation has gotten to people thinking about what they can do as a climate scientist. And often they get asked, what is it that I can do? People ask climate scientists, what can I do as an individual? And then it gets you thinking about what do I say to that? And it's gone through the various cycles of, oh, you should eat less meat. There are little actions that you can take in your everyday lives to fight climate change. But I think what we've settled on is actually we should talk about it. And actually that's one of the important things. So talking about climate science and making sure that the issue stays on the table and people, that it's an everyday conversation, mentioning it to people around you, making sure they're aware of what the big issues are, what's changing in the world, what the latest science says, I think is really important. And the last thing I would like to say is the way in which science helps is it tells you about our possible futures. And some of those are really bleak. And we've seen the heat waves that have been happening around the world. The latest IPCC report tells you that those heat waves are attributed to climate change. And the evidence there is really clear. And most geographical areas of the world have seen heat waves. So we've already seen the effects of climate change. Every bit of warming that we're going to get is going to make this worse. So having the science there means that various countries can be prepared in terms of their adaptation and their mitigation strategies. So I think science underpins all of this, and as scientists we have a moral duty to actually communicate these results and talk about it. And
Thank you. And over to Tom.
Tom.
Gosh, I don't think I want to follow any of the speakers, but thank you to everybody. It was absolutely fascinating and sort of both really very sort of terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. I think I'm going to focus more on some of the practicalities of what we've been doing here and across our estate. And I was thinking about how that links into leadership. And I think the key thing for us here is that we can demonstrate what can be done practically. And I think that is demonstrable leadership. And that's sort of the focus of what I want to say now. I mean, we started by looking at the science-based target structure that the university developed and following that. And we very quickly realized as a part of that our targets for eliminating natural gas from our site needed to be exceptionally ambitious. I mean, and that's led us to have a key performance indicator that involves never again installing any gas boilers across campus, whether that be on a new building or in replacement of one that's already operating when it ultimately gives out. Now, to actually do that, we have to absolutely fill our buildings with insulation. You can't just swap these things across, and it's so frustrating because nobody sees any of that. You know, it's 85% of the work is filling, lagging and insulation and secondary glazing and all of that kind of thing, and nobody really notices it. But it facilitates everything else. So to give you an example, we've just finished the refurbishment of a large 1920s building, and we've retrofitted it as extensively as we felt we could whilst maintaining the sort of heritage of that property. And it's now run by a 16 kilowatt, in this instance, air source heat pump. It was an 80 kilowatt gas boiler. So not only have we removed fossil fuels from it, but we've massively reduced the amount of energy that's used to heat and provide hot water to that building. I mean, over the course of even a year, it's tens of thousands of kilowatts. So it can be done, but you can't really see a lot of it. So elsewhere on site, we're trying to do things that are a bit more visible as well. We've got about 20,000 square meters of flat roof space that are suitable for solar power generation. And we're at an early stage. We've just completed one of the first phases of a large project to use as much of that space as we possibly can. Ultimately, we think we're going to be able to do about 2/3 of all of our power need at current power levels anyway. I mean, with the increase in electrification of our vehicle fleet and increased use of heat pumps, our electricity demand is going to rise. But 2/3 of current levels is an enormous amount of energy. It's frustrating, though, again, that actually that's relatively invisible because you can't really see them up on the roofs, which in some ways is good and in some ways is a bit of a shame. But it's certainly a big part of it. One of the reasons we've been able to do that is because of the leadership that actually has been shown, and I've been really, it's fair to say surprised by, but really pleased by, from our staff at all levels. We're able to do that project because the installations are being completed by our in-house team of engineers and electricians, not by an external company. Now, that means that the capital expenditure cost is much, much lower than it otherwise would be. And the payback periods are very quick compared to normal business case studies that we would do. And I can remember a conversation over 18 months ago with the lead electrician when we were talking about this. You know, one of the big problems we were having with our photovoltaic projects was that we just couldn't get the supply of skilled people to do these installations from contractors. There's just not that many people. And we said, you know, how do you feel about it? And they sort of said, well, we'll have a go. You know, and you know, thereafter now we've got a very highly skilled team of people that can do installations of that, and we're working on heat pump installation as well. So, you know, it's that kind of leadership, that sort of understanding of why this is important, that sort of have-a-go attitude that I think is just so important, and it's probably quite Churchill, I think, as well, which is convenient. I think I'll just finish on the last sort of big area, and this is probably the most visible, and that's our landscape. You know, we're very, very lucky here to have about 50 acres now, something like that, when you include all the Stories Way over sort of that way. Whilst it is very green, a lot of that space is sports fields. You know, it's not very biodiverse. And we've been doing a lot of work recently, which has been fantastically supported by the Green officers, including George and Tale, who is here, to change that. And you know, within our targets, that includes 5 acres of additional meadowing, planting of hundreds of trees, formation of multiple natural ponds, other habitat work, biodiverse green roofs. You know, the list goes on. And these things are all very visible. And whilst I'm not suggesting they're going to solve the huge problems that we've seen here today, if we can inspire a generation of leaders like George to do something about it and to really take that forward, then that is a very, very worthwhile thing to do.
Excellent. Well, 4 very different perspectives showing different parts of the community doing different things. It's now open to questions. We have one come in over Zoom, which we'll start with, and I think this is really addressed to Polly. How will we know if COP26 has been a success?
Well, we will certainly get some early indications as to which countries are going to be stepping up and which countries are stepping away. We've heard some rather troubling noises from some countries only in the last 24 hours of wanting to reduce the level of ambition. But we will know the extent to which countries make formal binding commitments. And then we will have to wait and see whether they actually deliver on those commitments. We've seen only too often promises made and not delivered. So we won't know. What we will know is the level of commitment from some of the key nations, the United States and China being absolutely pivotal. To be honest, if they come on board as much as we need them to, we are on the route to having a greater level of success than we might otherwise have. So that's the best I can do by way of finding an optimistic answer after all that pessimism, that doom and gloom that I've poured all over you this evening.
Excellent. Thank you. Any questions from the audience here? Andrew, you'll have to shout because there are no mics.
Yeah, well, so I hesitate to bring more negativity, but just a way of considering it partly goes to George and partly to Tom about what we've been doing in the college, and I think it's wonderful what is happening in the college, don't get me wrong. But what kind of dangers might there be in those kind of everyday activities or infrastructural activities which give a sort of symbolic sense of progress, while maybe being more palliative in the big picture than anything else. So what I'm trying to get at is the balance between thinking that those kinds of activities are inspiring, that they train you personally and maybe inspire others in good behaviors, versus the possibility that those kinds of things in our everyday lives or in the planting of meadows, that there's a kind of, a sort of symbolic gesture which maybe is ultimately a bit palliative and could lead, perhaps, to see it very negatively. I don't necessarily believe this, but it could lead to a kind of failure, ultimately, to take the really substantial actions which are needed.
George, would you like to start with that?
I can start with that, and I'm really glad that Andrew's raised that, because that's something that I think about quite a lot. That what's the actual danger of kind of gesturing and performative acts of climate improvement, I guess. But for me, a principle that's really important is honesty throughout, and talking and discussion. So throughout, we're aware that it may be just a symbolic feature, but then we discuss and explain why symbolic features are important, because they inspire people. And it's to make that understanding that, yeah, there are things that, on a truly global scale, the things that matter. So reducing our gas emissions, for example, and also reducing red meat consumption on a personal level, but also accountability for the biggest corporations responsible for emissions. So for me, the solution to that, I guess, would be discussion, bringing people together and talking about the realities of things, and that maybe one person's life isn't going to make the biggest difference, but it's having that honesty and communicating that honestly, that maybe things don't always add up, but there's, yeah, basically I've said, I think I said it already, honesty is important.
Steve, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, George is absolutely right here. I think the danger is when people feel as though they've done enough, so they've done their recycling, whatever it might be, and they've walked away and they've got their credits, and that's it. But we know, I'm no psychologist, but as far as I'm aware, if people make a small commitment, they're more likely to make a larger one. It's kind of a gateway. And so if that doesn't happen, then the communication's wrong. And so it's about getting that communication right about it, and it's about trying to encourage people down that route. So it's how you frame the whole thing, I think.
I think what I'd add to that is that some of this is about demonstrable leadership again. Some of these, these are individual projects in a lot of these instances on the estate, but in some cases they're the first time this model has been adopted, certainly among the colleges. So for example, doing the installations in-house for heat pumps or photovoltaics. As far as I'm aware, and apologies to any colleges that are doing this, I don't think anybody's doing that because it's quite a different model to adopt. And it's the same, the 1920s house I alluded to, it's the kind of building that you'd look at and think, that's not going to be easy to retrofit. We're not going to be able to do that. And it would have been very easy in that instance and some others to go back with another gas boiler, say, because it's too difficult to do. And I think showing that it can be done, even if it's in part just sort of showing up people that aren't doing it, is a positive thing that can have a wider impact beyond the sort of project itself.
Perhaps following on from that is another question over Zoom from Hannah saying, I'm a vegetarian and I bike everywhere. What else can I do to help the planet? Big or little things? So that's a sort of very specific version. Who'd like to come in on that? What else can I assume?
I'd say a few bits of that. I think one of the big things is advocacy in a lot of these instances. I think take every opportunity you can to advocate to everybody in any position of power to make positive change in this sector. I think something that's really struck me over the last year is some of the work of some of the students involved with the Engage for Change project. And George is probably better placed to talk about this than me. But I mean, it made certainly the projects that I've been involved with through that project and through the student engagement and the advocacy are things that were blind spots for me, and that advocacy I think is just so important.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that, that in the climate game, I guess, the words are an extremely powerful thing. and they carry a lot of weight. So if you can use your voice, and I guess if you're studying here, use your studies, the topics you interest yourself in, the discussions you have with your supervisors, if you bring it in and bring it as a central part of your life and your friendship groups, use your words. They are extremely powerful. Yeah.
Perhaps I could throw a question in at this point, probably to Polly. I mean, one of the arguments I hear, let's have more wind turbines or electric cars or whatever, and then people say, but the electric cars are heavier, they actually need more energy overall than a normal petrol car, and the materials that go into wind turbines, well, we've got to go and dig them up in the Congo or wherever it may be. And they always will find a sort of counter-argument for maintaining the status quo. And how should we be addressing that? I mean, partly it's back to Alison's point about data. And I often feel I want more data about how to look at the whole life, of what goes into these things. What else can we do?
Well, I mean, it comes back to the points that Steve was making. I think that increasingly we have to demand that people are using an evidence base, a proper evidence base for the decisions they make. So when somebody says, this is a better option than that, and you can tell that what they're doing is trying to escape from having to make the commitment that's the least convenient to them, I think we have to learn to challenge them. And I spend my whole life challenging, by and large, well-meaning business leaders, but for whom this is a really inconvenient truth. And so you just have to hold them to account. And they are increasingly being required to be held to account. So I think you call on the evidence base. That's why this university is so important. It can give the evidence that you need to make these really important decisions and leave no place to hide. That's what we have to do, no place to hide.
I totally agree with that. The trouble is it's not always easy to get your hands on the evidence, and certainly, you're talking to someone over dinner, and I'm suddenly thinking, I can't counter that off the top of my head. Does Cambridge Zero have all this data easily accessible?
Well, I think that's a really important point, actually, because it's almost like you want a crib sheet, don't you, of response to the most common, and I think that'd be a fantastic thing. Because let's face it, all of these questions have been answered before. It's not like there isn't an answer to them. Our brains aren't going to be able to pull everything at once, and some people are better at responding to these things than others. But what Alison was talking about earlier about these, how you get these big policy documents, actually that's part of the process here. Part of the problem is a lot of the answers to these questions are buried in these massive technical, we talked about you quoted Stern earlier. The Stern Review, an enormous document in the noughties, 2005, I think, or 6. But it was massive. Most of the people in Parliament hadn't read it. So, we have a really important role to get those important answers, the important data, and make it presentable to people so it's easy to understand.
And even if the academic community doesn't have a chance, if people want to find out this information, it is available. The world is alive with consultants who are selling you those answers. So if you want to find it, you can. It's only when people are trying to deflect you that I think you have to really call their bluff.
Well, I think, what do they call them? The kinds of things you used to carry around, a pocketbook or something Macomb, I can't think what it was called.
I only know about filofaxes.
Well, all right, let's have a filofax with 6 questions you'll be asked about wind farms and, that birds fly into them, all these kinds of things, Let's have some easy...
Cards, a little
card
card
cards,
system.
That's right. You say, no, you're wrong because. I would really like that at dinners in college. Marcial.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Polly for a very smooth, elegant presentation with a lot of very good graphics. Rather terrifying, some of them, but very, very good. But I would like, on the practical level now, what we can do, like Tom was saying. The proposal of eliminating the gas in the next, whatever, 10, 20 years, I find it very unlikely that will be possible, because 21 million households uses gas today to heat their houses. And I think the pump, the heat pump, are not all that effective. I have tried them, and I have done it, in reality. And there is a sort of a marginal good as we think about. So it will be very difficult to substitute 21 million houses with heat pumps. Apart from being very expensive, very difficult to do, I don't think they are as good as the present heating system. And I agree with you. In some places, you can improve insulation. And many historical buildings, it's very difficult to do it. Very difficult because they are protected and so on. So it's very difficult. I wonder if anybody of you knows more about possibility of using hydrogen instead of gas as a possibility of substituting, or is it possible to do or not? That's my question.
I've got a couple of bits to add to that, although I'm absolutely not going to comment on whether we can use hydrogen, which would be very exciting, but way outside of my area of expertise. Boris announced this week that 2035 is the last date in the UK we'll be able to install gas-fired domestic boilers, and at the same time announced a grant and a limited grant only for the first 90,000 homes in the next 3 years for installation of heat pumps. So we have got, the clock is ticking now to move across, and I think hydrogen potentially through the gas network could be a really exciting option as we have that gas infrastructure in place. How long it'll take to get that in, absolutely I don't know, but I think certainly in the interim, this is our best bet. And I would add that actually I think you're quite right. I mean, I live in a home with ground source heat pumps. It's a very old building. It's from the 17th century, and they're absolutely it'd be certainly more efficient for us to heat it with gas. But there's other bits at play here around fossil fuel usage. So it's a complicated argument.
Yeah, there's lots of interest and enthusiasm, particularly in green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen. I read a wonderful article on an Australian coal miner who went off and then did his PhD on energy and has now invested his billions that he made out of the coal industry into hydrogen, into green hydrogen in particular. So I think these technologies are evolving so quickly. I don't think we can allow ourselves to say it can't be done purely on the basis of cost. If the reality is we haven't measured we're not measuring the right things if we allow just cost to be the only argument when you think about some of these challenges that we face. So I think we have to find the money if it's doable to make that transition into heat pumps, whatever it might be. But I do think if we make that shift and set policies that say we're going to make that shift, then I think the technology will follow much more quickly if we show our intention to get out of gas and certainly out of fossil fuels to the possible extent that we can. And Stephen, you know all this stuff from your...
I wish I knew more about hydrogen. All I know is that there seem to be a lot of different opinions on it. I'm also very cautious about a kind of, a golden ticket sort of solution to these. And I agree with everything that's been said. I think, we know that there are problems with, infrastructure problems regarding sort of ground source and air source heating. These are tricky. We have to find some way of overcoming them. It shouldn't stop us putting them in new builds. And ultimately, the stakes are too high for us not to be going down this route.
Tallow.
Can I come back to one thing? As I understand, the hydrogen, blue hydrogen, is a reality. I think in Chile, for example, where I come from, they are really going a big way. And as I understand, they will start exporting that. I'm not sure how you export hydrogen, I suppose in tankers like you export gas. So it seems to me logically that you can export that kind of hydrogen and inject into the network that we have. And we have built it out over 20 or 30 years, and we have this network. And it may be possible, but I am not sure about the technology, to inject, instead of gas, inject hydrogen. That's possible.
Tallow.
Yeah,
So I think to me, climate change is already here. We're already seeing the effects of it, and the extreme events are happening around us. And the graph that Polly showed, where you have this linear relationship, near linear relationship between amount of CO2 and surface warming, tells you that any other CO2 that you put into the atmosphere will cause the extreme events that we're seeing to get worse and to become more frequent. So any CO2 that we can stop putting into the atmosphere, and in fact, if we can start removing it from the atmosphere, I see that as a win. And the rest is, you know, we need the adaptation, we need the mitigation strategies to go with that. So I think that when I'll be looking very closely at COP26, and any decisions, any countries that commit to drastic reductions in CO2, I see that as a win, and we should be happy about that. So there's sort of small glimmers of hope.
So, I mean, I can have the job that I have if I didn't have some optimism. I'd just sort of bury my head somewhere and hope everything would go away. But I am optimistic. I'm not optimistic that COP is going to be successful, at least as a negotiation, you know, because I think it's really, really hard. But I am very optimistic that as a way of mobilizing the community, the way, and by which I mean a kind of global community, you know, and sort of inspiring action, I think it's already happening, you know. One of the things that I find incredible is that we're just coming out of, well, I say we're just coming out of, but we've just had this, you know, global sort of situation where, you know, we've been sort of working from home. It's been, you know, a horrendous situation which has completely impacted on everything that we've done. And has climate dropped out of the agenda? No, it hasn't. You know, through that time, I'd say is actually, you know, it's stayed up there. It's become a very dominant thing. And part of this is because there is a generation, as George was saying, who have known nothing but this. You know, this is the reality that they were born into. And that gives a very, very different sort of take on the world. And it also holds people, you know, of a slightly earlier generation, like me, just 10 years or so, I missed it. You know, it holds us to account. It forces that action. And I think that's why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic in people like George, basically.
Yeah, I would build on that. I make a distinction between whether I'm hopeful and whether I'm optimistic. I'm kind of hopeful because I think hope is grounded in the possibility for change. And I do think we can change. So on that level, I feel quite hopeful quite a lot of the time. I must admit, I don't spend as much time as I would like feeling optimistic, but when I need a bit of an injection of optimism, I come to the student body and spend time with them, because that's the place where I think, okay, I can feel optimistic at their sheer determination and ability and belief and self-belief, all those things. It's not always grounded in experience, but it's grounded in, this is my future you're talking about. And so I retreat to the generation that's 10 years younger than Steve, but he does a good job for me too.
Right, I've got one last question from Zoom from Rod Hine. It's a fairly specific question, and I sort of maybe misinterpreted as a sort of argument for retaining the status quo. I understand that we need to reduce or eliminate fossil fuels, but where do we then get the materials that are byproducts, such as lubricating oils or feedstock for plastics? We can't go back to killing whales for lubricating oils, and I think we can all agree with that last statement.
I'm kind of looking hopefully at Alison to see whether she's got any comments on that.
So, Polly talked about the circular economy. Part of it is manufacturing in ways in which you can get the plastics and then reuse them. You can, I'm not an expert in where you get lubricating oils from.
It's a very specific question there.
Yes, it's a very specific question. But I kind of feel that you shouldn't confuse net zero with no emissions at all. What it is there are going to be fossil fuel emissions. But when you reach net zero, you also have negative emissions to balancing that. Whether that comes from carbon capture or other measures that we take, it feels like, at least for the next 100 years we are going to be using fossil fuels in some form or another. But it's kind of removing most of the fossil fuels from most areas where we could replace it with something that is not a fossil fuel, but still have it in areas where we can't do that, and also have something to compensate for those emissions.
There's a big difference between net zero and absolute zero.
Yeah.
Well, we ought to wrap up at this point. It's been a fascinating discussion with, obviously, lots of questions. In some ways, we should have finished with the optimism bit. So we're relying on George. We're relying on George and Tale and all our colleagues to maintain this planet, I think. But we also need the experienced people like Polly and our other panelists. So thank you all very much, and particularly thanks to Polly.